On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in human history began. Thousands of ships stretched across the English Channel. Tens of thousands of soldiers prepared to storm the beaches of France. Above them, the sky roared with the sound of Allied aircraft. Below, the dark waters hid submarines and mines waiting to strike. This was DAT, the Allied invasion of Normandy, the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. But to understand just how monumental this operation was, we have to look beyond the heroism and the chaos of that single day. We have to ask, how did the Allies plan such a colossal undertaking? Why was Normandy chosen? And how did the events of June 6th shape the rest of the war? The story begins not in 1944, but years earlier. By 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered much of Western Europe. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, resisting invasion through courage and air power in the Battle of Britain. But the truth was stark. Britain could not liberate Europe on its own. America's entry into the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941 brought new strength. It had also raised the question of strategy. Should the Allies invade Western Europe immediately? Or should they focus first on North Africa and Italy? For a long time, Winston Churchill argued for what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, striking through the Mediterranean. But Joseph Stalin, whose Soviet Union was locked in a brutal struggle against the Germans on the Eastern Front, had one demand: open a second front in the West to relieve pressure on his armies. By 1943, after victories in North Africa and Italy, the time had come. The Allies began planning Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of France. But where should the landings take place? The shortest route across the English Channel was to the Pas-de-Calais, directly opposite Britain. It was the most obvious choice, and the Germans expected it. That's precisely why the Allies chose Normandy instead. The beaches there offered wide-open stretches for landings, while being less heavily defended than Calais. Still, even Normandy bristled with German fortifications bunkers. Artillery, barbed wire, and mines, part of what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. To succeed, the Allies would need deception, preparation, and overwhelming force. And so, one of the greatest deception operations in history began. Operation Bodyguard aimed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Fake armies were created with inflatable tanks, wooden planes, and even radio traffic to simulate activity. General George Patton, whom the Germans respected as a brilliant commander, was placed in charge of this phantom force. German intelligence bought the ruse. Even when the invasion at Normandy began, Hitler remained convinced it was only a diversion, waiting for a real landing at Calais. This hesitation would prove fatal. Meanwhile, in Britain, preparations reached a fever pitch. Hundreds of thousands of American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops trained for the assault. Engineers designed specialized landing craft capable of carrying men, tanks, and supplies directly onto beaches. Mulberry Harbor's massive floating docks were secretly built to create instant ports once the beaches were taken. Even pipelines, known as Pluto, were laid under the channel to deliver fuel to the invading forces. The scale of planning was staggering. Over 5,000 ships would be involved, from mighty battleships to small landing craft. More than 11,000 aircraft would provide cover. And on D-Day itself, over 156,000 men would land on French soil. But before the landings, the Allies needed to weaken German defenses. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies launched a massive air campaign, bombing railways, bridges, and airfields across France. Resistance groups in occupied France were activated to sabotage German communications. Every effort was made to disrupt enemy movement. Still, the Germans were not unaware. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Hitler's most skilled commanders, was tasked with fortifying Normandy. He knew the Allies would come, and he wanted to stop them on the beaches before they could establish a foothold. Rommel ordered beach obstacles, mines, and anti-tank defenses placed along the shoreline. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the fate of Europe. Then came the night of June 5, 1944. Allied ships filled the harbors of southern England. Paratroopers prepared to drop behind enemy lines. Soldiers wrote letters home, some knowing they would never return. Weather threatened to postpone the invasion, but meteorologists identified a brief window of opportunity. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, made the fateful decision, okay, let's go. D-Day would begin at dawn. Shortly after midnight on June 6th, the first blows were struck. Thousands of paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, dropped into the dark fields of Normandy. Their mission was to seize bridges, destroy key defenses, and sow chaos behind German lines. The drops were chaotic, with many soldiers scattered far from their objectives. Yet through determination and improvisation, they disrupted German movements and secured vital positions. These airborne troops paid a heavy price, but their efforts were crucial in slowing down German reinforcements. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Allied battleships and cruisers opened fire, pounding German defenses along the coast. The sky filled with aircraft striking bunkers, artillery, and strongpoints. Then, as the sun rose, the landing craft began their approach. 5 beaches had been chosen for the assault: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. Each beach would test the courage of the men who landed there. At Utah Beach, the Americans landed with relative success. Strong currents pushed them slightly off course, but this turned out to be a blessing. They landed in a less heavily defended sector, and casualties were lighter than expected. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., despite being ill and armed only with a cane, led his men ashore, famously declaring, "We'll start the war from right here." By the end of the day, the Americans had pushed several miles inland, but at Omaha Beach, the story was far more grim. The Germans were entrenched in fortified positions on the cliffs overlooking the beach. As the landing craft lowered their ramps, American soldiers were met with a storm of machine gun fire, artillery, and mortar. Entire units were cut down before they could even make it ashore. The beach became a scene of chaos and carnage, with bodies and wrecked equipment littering the sand. For hours, it seemed the assault might fail. Yet small groups of survivors, through courage and sheer will, managed to scale the cliffs, silence German positions, and gradually secure the beachhead. By nightfall, Omaha was in Allied hands, but at a terrible cost. Over 2,000 American casualties in a single day at Gold Beach. British forces fought their way through heavy defenses, but managed to secure key towns and link up with Canadian forces at Juno. The Canadians at Juno faced fierce resistance at first, suffering significant losses in the opening waves. But they pressed forward with determination, advancing further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. At Sword Beach, the British made steady progress and linked up with paratroopers holding key bridges. Though German counterattacks threatened their positions by the evening of June 6th, the Allies had landed over 150,000 troops and established a precarious foothold in Normandy. Casualties were high, around 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, but the invasion had succeeded. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, but D-Day was only the beginning. The battle for Normandy would rage for weeks. The Allies had to fight through the dense hedgerows of the French countryside, facing fierce resistance from German panzer divisions. Cities like Caen were reduced to rubble in brutal fighting. Yet slowly, relentlessly, the Allies pushed forward. By late July, Operation Cobra allowed American forces to break out of the bocage and sweep across France. Paris was liberated in August. The German army, though still formidable, was now in retreat. The significance of D-Day cannot be overstated. It was not just a military victory, it was a symbol. It demonstrated Allied unity with Americans, British, Canadians, and many others fighting side by side. It showed the effectiveness of planning, deception, and sheer determination. Most importantly, it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Less than a year later, in May 1945, the war in Europe would be over. Yet D-Day also reminds us of the human cost of war. The bravery of soldiers charging into gunfire, the sacrifice of paratroopers landing in darkness, The resilience of civilians caught in the crossfire, these stories endure. The beaches of Normandy today are quiet, marked with memorials and cemeteries where thousands of white crosses stand in silence. They are a reminder of the price of freedom, and of a day when ordinary men did extraordinary things. So when we ask what was D-Day, it was the turning point, the moment when the tide of war shifted irreversibly against Nazi Germany. It was the largest, most complex invasion ever attempted, carried out against immense odds. And it was a triumph of courage, strategy, and sacrifice. This was the D-Day landings, the invasion of Normandy, the day the Allies began to take back Europe